We are recording. If you have any questions throughout tonight, please do either raise your hand or pop them in the chat. I will keep an eye on the chat, and I will be here in the background. But without further ado, I will pass over to Letzi and Paul.
Well, good evening, everyone. On to the next slide. Tonight, we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at critical thinking because it's a very important part of the course, of the module that you're all studying on, whichever module it is. It's very, very important to understand critical thinking, not only in approaching your assessment assignment, but also in your everyday life and in doing things at work or even doing things at home. Critical thinking is valuable in lots of different ways, and we'll explain a little bit about that to begin with. We'll start off with what is critical thinking, the origins of critical thinking, questions a critical thinker might ask, improving your critical thinking skills, actively demonstrating critical thinking and artificial intelligence, and then we'll have some breakout groups with a bit of a discussion. Quick summary at the end, and then any questions if you felt you wanted to save them until the end. But as Chloe said, please feel free to just put your hand up or ask a question if something's not clear, or if you've got a contribution to make. Thank you very much. On to the next slide. So there are a number of definitions that are given. I've chosen quite a few different definitions here that are mainly university based, not only from the UK, but also further afield. But what you'll see is all the different definitions here have themes that cross over between them. So a number of the words come up a number of different times in each of the definitions. So one of the very important words is about the art of making clear reasoned judgments. And that will be something that we'll look into later on. You can see some of the other definitions also talk about, the last one talks about making reliable judgments. And it's thinking about how do you actually judge whether something is good or bad, whether it's relevant, whether it's accurate. And some of that will also touch on the discussions that we'll have about AI, because AI can be a force for the good, but it also can sometimes cause confusion or indeed be misleading. And we'll touch on that a little bit later as well. So some of the things that you're asked to do in your assessment assignment are often to critically assess, critically appraise, and that will require, first of all, understanding what you're being asked to do. Secondly, interpreting different aspects of it, maybe weighing up different arguments in the second point here, thinking what questions you need to ask, thinking of what opinions you thought of first of all. Once you've formed your opinions, who else has thought about that? Are there any other bits of evidence that underpin that or underline that? It's also about taking things with an open mind, questioning things, not just taking it at face value. And that is also something that we'll dig into quite a lot this evening. Next slide, please. So one of the other things which you'll see, some of these words came up in the definition: analysing, interpreting, evaluating, inferring, explaining, and self-reflection. And those I'll come on to in just a moment in a bit more detail. But I quite like this definition, which is a definition of someone called Dr. Peter Facioni, who's an expert in critical thinking, and he described critical thinking as the process of forming reflective, well-reasoned judgments, that word judgment again, about what to believe or what to do. It relies on our skills of analysis, interpretation, evaluation, inference, explanation, and most importantly, self-reflection. It's motivated by our desire to seek the truth courageously, ask challenging questions, to be open-minded, to trust in the power of reason, and to make wise and thoughtful choices. And I think that's a really good definition, probably better, even better than some of the ones we had before. Next slide, please. So the actual concept of critical thinking isn't new. It's something that's been around for a long time. And the actual roots of critical thinking can be traced right the way back more than 2,500 years, back to the time of the ancient Greek philosopher Socrates. And he established the fact that you cannot depend on those in positions of authority to automatically possess sound knowledge and insight, as they may still think and act irrationally. Well, that could describe all sorts of politicians. I won't name any in particular, but that's as true today as it was then 2,500 years ago. So one of the things he was trying to do was to encourage people to challenge in a methodical way and to actually be critical, with the word critical coming from the Greek kritikos, meaning able to judge or discern. And it's how you're able to judge or discern, particularly when you're approaching your assessment assignment. If you make a statement, how do you know it's true? What evidence is there to back that up? Are there other points of view that are quite powerful? And how do you actually ensure that the point of view that you're putting across is maybe is it more important than the other points of view that you've come across, and how do you weigh up the different points of view to say where the truth lies? So Socrates established the importance of seeking evidence, closely examining the reasoning behind the facts. So if something is put forward as a fact, how do you know it's a fact? Assumptions made about them, analysing concepts and considering their implications. Some of the things that learners will often find difficult when doing their assessment assignment, doesn't really matter almost what module we're talking about, is they will know something through their own experience to be a fact. That may not be enough. You may need to find other evidence. You may need to find a model that supports your point of view, or you may need to find maybe an academic or maybe someone who's written a paper which supports that point of view in order to support that direction and to ensure that it's not just a thought that you have or a point of view that you have that's unsupported. Next slide, please. So very much when Socrates was working, he encouraged his students to reach their own conclusions. And part of that was by effectively doing critical thinking. So if someone came up with an idea, well, what is the truth behind that idea? Where has it come from? Is the source of it valid? So if you're talking even where you found evidence, is that a reliable source? What sort of deep and searching questions can you think of in order to get closer to the truth with critical thinking? How can you ensure that someone can justify their point of view when other people may have other seemingly valid points of view? So some of the questions that Socratic questions are applied to are: what do you mean by that? How do you know? Can you give me an example? What are the consequences of that? And what is the counter argument? And if you're preparing your assessment assignment and you're putting forward maybe your own point of view, if you actually run through some of these Socratic questions, then they will help you to dig deeper and to search for evidence that may support your point of view in lots of different directions. Next slide, please. I quite like this model to generate critical thinking. It's something that I know a number of my fellow tutors also use, and I think it originated from the University of Plymouth. And it shows how you can move from something that is merely description through to analysis and then on to evaluation. Because as you probably realize, if you're at level 7, if you're studying your assessment assignment, if your answer is predominantly description, then you're unlikely to pass. So you need to find ways of moving beyond description into analysis and evaluation by asking those Socratic questions, not accepting things at face value, things that you hear, things that you read, looking for evidence and good reasons before believing something to be true. And so the earlier questions, and quite often when you're putting forward a point of view, you may need a bit of description in order to give it some context to introduce it. What, where, when, who, maybe slightly getting on to the why. Then you start going to analysis. Why is it that? What evidence is there? How do we know that? What if? And onto the evaluation. What if, so what next? And those are when you start getting deeper into the critical thinking model. Next question, or next slide, please. So higher levels of critical thinking above description are looking at how you can apply something. This particular diagram here says what skills are demonstrated and what sort of questions you could ask. So in applying something, what would happen if? It's almost like approaching it from a scientific viewpoint, looking at a scientific model. What would happen if you put that switch down, or whatever? Analysing, where you're comparing, organising, deconstructing. Why is this particular point important? What are the implications of that point of view? Then you get on to evaluating, which is where the judgment, critique, which leads on to conclusion, may come from. But in order to get to that concluding or conclusion, you need to be able to explain it clearly. You may think that it's obvious, but you need to be able to find a succinct way of explaining your point of view. What's happening? What is the best approach if you're putting forward approach? And why is it better than some of the others? What might some of the challenges be? And how might you overcome them? And then the third area of demonstrable skills is around creation, and that is constructing, planning and designing and producing. So it's actually trying to find a new way, a new model. There may be a model that you've come across, or maybe a few, and you may be able to come up with your own ideas, your own individual model by taking elements of each and justifying why those elements fit together and why it's relevant to put them together in order to produce a totally different view of life or whatever your answer is going towards. Next slide, please. So it really starts to explore in a bit more detail the elements that we touched on right at the very beginning. And you can look at these in lots of different ways. You don't always have to work through in this order. Sometimes you'll jump about with the order in which you look at these key elements. So what will you look at first? Well, you need to understand the question you've been asked. You need to then you might even go into interpretation to make sense of it by clarifying the meaning and the implications of it. Or you might start by digging into the analysis of it and looking at the different components, breaking them down into simpler ideas that make up a more complex whole, looking at greater insight. So in other words, you might start with something that looks fairly simple to start off with, but the more you dig into it, the more interpretation and evaluation that you have around that, that may well develop into something much more complex. But as you develop your argument or your point of view into something more complex, you need to ensure that other people can understand why you're coming at it from that direction and why it's relevant. So that is also important. If you're putting forward evaluation based mainly on a particular reference, why is that reference relevant? Is it from a reliable source? Is it up to date? Are there other ideas that have come about more recently that might actually squash that idea and that might take things in another direction? If so, why is it changing, or why is it moving in that other direction? The inference is where you're logically connecting and also querying different evidence. And it might be taking evidence from a journal, or it might be from a policy statement or something like that. And it will also be looking at what assumptions maybe you can draw from that and what assumptions other people have drawn, and why do you think that is relevant at this moment? And that's why the context, even with a bit of description, is important. So where payment by results at one time was an extremely valid way of reimbursing for healthcare, we live in different times now, and now there are moves towards including other elements which reflect value and quality more than the original, in some ways, more simplistic payment by results model. Explanation. So again, sometimes you may think it is absolutely clear why you have put forward your point of view, but if you haven't explained it well enough, then it may well be that with an examiner reading your assessment assignment, you're unable to take them with you in that particular direction. So it's very, very important that where you're putting forward ideas, where you're linking models, where you're digging deeper in order to come up with your new original model, perhaps, or your original viewpoint, that you take your reader with you by making it clear why you think that's valid, why the evidence supports your point of view, not just having things that are hanging and that are unlinked. So actually linking different elements when you're writing your assessment assignment in order to build the bigger viewpoint is very important. Your own self-reflection will also help you in looking at things from a critical thinking point of view. And some of that is actually ensuring whether or questioning yourself about whether your own personal beliefs or prejudices or whatever you want to call them might have crept in and might be distorting your point of view. And that is another time when through self-reflection, if you can ask the question, well, why might someone else have a different point of view? Why might that actually be more valid than the point of view that I came up with first? And to actually look at that in detail. And you may actually eventually discard it, but you need to be clear why you've discarded it and why it may be less relevant than your original point of view that you put forward. Next slide, please. So again, this is really just a different cut of a similar sort of thing. And again, with this wheel, you can go across it, you can go up, you can go down. Probably one of the places that most people will start is thinking, well, what is the question at issue? So is raising questions, but you might start at the purpose or goal or objective and then put questions around that. Then going on to information, interpretation, concepts, assumptions, implications and consequences, but building in points of view maybe at an earlier stage in order to make sure that you haven't closed down your implications and consequences too early, because there may be other perfectly valid points of view that take things in a slightly different direction. So all of that within that is a way, by applying these different elements, they enable you to solve problems and find practical and effective solutions to often very tricky issues identified by using the information that you've gathered, analysing it, and then drawing logical conclusions from it. Next slide, please. And some of this Paul will be going on to in a little bit more detail in the next part, where he looks at how you can apply critical thinking and gives practical examples about how you can do that. And within the order of this: purpose, questions, information, it won't always be in that order. As I say, sometimes people will start with one, and it may be something almost like a circle where you'll go round a few elements of this and you'll come back maybe to the beginning. You may change the original point of view, or you may change the questions, or you may look at things in a different way. But here are some of the questions that you might start to ask that bring you into that next step towards what Paul will be discussing, which is looking at how you can actually apply critical thinking. So some of the questions that you might want to ask yourself are: what's the purpose in addressing this? What are the key questions emerging from that particular problem? What information is most relevant to answering those questions? And it may well be in the health service, it may well be that you can think of a fantastic solution, but there may be real limitations in terms of maybe skills of individuals, money, time, power, all sorts of things that may mean that you have to take account of those and you have to move in a slightly different direction, or maybe at a slightly different pace. What are the most important concepts needed to frame your thinking? So often within each module, you'll find that we introduce new ideas, theories, principles, models, whatever you want to call them. And some of them can be extremely helpful in just using as a framework when you're looking into solving a particular problem. What assumptions are being made? So when you make assumptions, what are you taking for granted? And are any of your assumptions unjustified? And again, that comes to actually thinking about linking with maybe number 7. What are other people's points of view? And how might that change the assumptions? So as I say, the elements here are not a circle where you go all the way round. You can jump between different elements and back again. What are the implications of solving or failing to solve the problem? So there may be advantages and disadvantages. There may be other possible outcomes of a different option. What are the consequences following on from that particular decision? So it's actually taking that one step further when you're looking at it. What are the different points of view? Well, that often will depend where you're starting from and what other points of view might be around that are relevant. So after bringing all those elements together, and making sense of all those parts of critical thinking and applying reasoning to them, you then hopefully will come up with your interpretation of the best solution, or perhaps what you might call a conclusion to the problem. And even then, you need to think, are there multiple conflicting points of view? In which case, does that then decide which solution is best and why that particular solution is better than the others? Thank you. Next slide, please. So when you think about how to improve your critical thinking skills, that there are a number of ways in which you can do it. Some of you may do it instinctively. Some people find it relatively easy to do critical thinking. Most of us don't. Children are often very good at critical thinking, but that's something I think that is maybe squeezed out of us as we grow up. And when we stop asking questions, we get told we can't keep asking questions. Whereas with small children, they ask endless questions, as you often find out. So if you start by clarifying your thinking, purpose and context, question your sources of information to find the most appropriate information, identify arguments and consider why they're valued. And you may start off with half a dozen arguments and you may reject some of them. You may keep some of them in your answer and justify why you have disposed of some of the arguments. You may want to analyse how sources, arguments, theories and processes work up to a point, as long as that doesn't bring about too much description. Then you might want to go on to evaluate arguments of others and strengths and weaknesses of their evidence. And the final thing that we touched on earlier was the importance of trying to find a new solution, trying to find a new way of thinking about this that maybe no one else has thought of quite the same way. And this is creativity or synthesis in order to create your own arguments, bringing together your own analysis, evaluation and reasoning, and introducing those new insights and perspectives they may bring. Next slide. So again, some of these things may be ways of actually pushing it a bit further. And I talked about the importance of not taking things at face value and asking questions constantly. What if? Why? What's the evidence? Are there other views? All of these. And these are things to bear in mind. Are we able to get a copy of this presentation? Yes, I think, is that possible, Chloe?
Yep, so same as the recording will be uploaded, the slides will be uploaded at the same time tomorrow.
Thank you very much, Chloe. There we are. It's good to ask questions. Seek diverse perspectives. And I think this is always good, looking for that. And certainly when I was a director of finance, I always respected the people who worked for me who had totally different views and didn't always agree with me. And very few people were brave enough to challenge me, unfortunately. But those that did, I respected deeply because they would often give me a different viewpoint and help me to look at things differently, because we can't know everything, and sometimes we
Then mine, for some reason, it was like.
So, and sometimes we tend to, by looking out for diverse ideas or perspectives, that would put us back on track in a direction that we would never have thought of by ourselves. Practice active listening by understanding other people's points of view before answering. Identify and challenge assumptions. So what are we taking for granted here? Is that assumption justified? Read widely and critically by analysing arguments in books, articles, evaluating the evidence and forming your own opinions. And that doesn't need to be about healthcare, it can be about anything. Practice problem solving puzzles, whatever you like doing, whatever you find fun. Keep a journal to clarify your thoughts on complex issues or decisions you're making. Or maybe you'd include within your journal complex issues or decisions that your colleagues are making, and whether you agree with that and whether there are other points of view. Seek feedback from trusted friends or colleagues to test your reasoning or decision making. So all of those elements there can help develop your critical thinking even further. Next slide, please. So we all use critical thinking, but why do we find it so difficult to do? Well, there are a number of reasons, and indeed, I think probably a few learners who've studied on different modules, some have found the assessment assignments to be quite challenging, having gone from one to another, because of the first thing. Critical thinking needs to be built on a strong foundation of knowledge with a good comprehension of the content and what is relevant. And each module is different and has different approaches and different elements. And indeed, some of you may well be doing elements of certain of the modules in your everyday jobs, and you may find it really easy to understand and interpret and take ideas forward. Others may not. So it really depends where you're coming from. And although it gives a general way of approaching problems, it's not simply adhering to a formula. And I think that's important because we need to understand the context to which it relates to every time. And as you would have seen with the assessment assignments, with the different contexts every time, that makes it more complicated and more challenges for some people to actually apply their critical thinking and to understand what's required of each assessment assignment. So when we see each context is different, we sometimes find it difficult to transfer these critical thinking skills appropriately. And sometimes it's only too easy to get drawn in by the detail and use that as a starting point for thinking or writing. Whereas if you can, it is far better to try and take a step back and try and see the overall picture and think about what principles, think about maybe some of the models that it may link to before you then drill down into the detail. Because often if you're focusing on the detail, then that starts to lead you along the path to describing the detail rather than to think about how different elements may link together. The final point, I think, is maybe we don't say this often enough, but critical thinking is hard work, as you need to demonstrate relevance, which involves identifying assumptions, analysing arguments and making inferences. By contrast, descriptive writing is easy or relatively easy. And I think that is one of the challenges for all of us whenever we're looking at critical thinking is how we can cope with that and actually find ways and different approaches to our critical thinking. Next slide, please. So next I'll hand you over to Paul, who will be demonstrating how to apply critical thinking skills.
Thank you very much, Lexi. And
thank you.
I'm going to do a couple of examples on that one. So hopefully, Chloe, if we can go on to the next slide. And I wanted to practice what I prove or prove what I practice. So a couple of weeks ago, I was on a Southern Railway train, which was actually moving up to London. And I thought, I'm going to think about how I actually do this. So I got out a blank piece of paper, put it on the table, which got stuck with someone's coffee, and got out the what, when, who, where model that Lexi's already gone through, and thought, right, I'm going to map out my thoughts on actually doing this presentation first of all, and use that model as I would use that model if I was doing a presentation. So hopefully, Chloe, moving on, I started with the description side. So what I did with the what. So the simple question of that is a presentation on application of critical thinking. But if you're doing critical, I'm going to use the but so theory. I'm not sure if it's actually an important theory or one that's recognized. And one of the things that really annoys me is my daughter's generation start sentences with the word so. I go, that drives me nuts. But I'm going to do the but so. So I'm doing that. So I'm doing a presentation on application of critical thinking, but Let's has already explained it. So I need to be consistent, but I also need to be original, just to keep you going. So there are implications, if you like, from that. So that's the what. When it's on Wednesday, well, it's here and now. And then I've got to think about it, but it's the evening. It's the end of a long day for learners who've now got back home. A couple of your L701 people in my cohort, I know, are probably eating at the moment. Joe, I know what you'll be doing. So I need to be engaging, and I need to keep within the time slot that Letsy's allowed me, because otherwise I'll get the eyes from her. So there are implications behind it. Who? Level 7 learners. That's simple. No, it's not. Because the level 7 learners, and they're not a single homogenous group. We range from clinicians, and there are some here, to finance, ops, to admin, primary care, to NHSE, via providers, CSUs, ambulance pharmacies, and all that sort of side of things. And indeed, all those learners have a different level of academic background. So some have already studied at level 7, some may have not, working through. So I need to think about how I pitch this in a way that everyone can appreciate it, that I'm not talking too high for some people, too low for others, and getting some enthusiasm, hopefully, behind it. And then the where, it's on Teams. Everybody's used to Teams, well, maybe Zoom and other types around, but this means that what I say and what my slides show need to be helpful and consistent, and also make sure the technology works, but that's Chloe's responsibility, so that we get effective communication. Because it's not just a question of my droning on, I've got to find a way of keeping you in touch and about it. So that's the description side. Moving on to the next part of the model, which is the analysis. So the question why am I doing this workshop? Well, the simple one, it's a requirement of you studying at level 7 with the HFMA, you've got to attend this. I know you're always keen to do this, but it's more than this. Because critical thinking is not just something to help you pass from a set, it's a skill for life. Hence, why was I sitting in a Southern Railway carriage with a piece of paper doing critical thinking? Why do I sit down sometimes with a blank piece of paper, or now the sun is shining, go and sit outside and actually do to this? So I need to really found that it's a skill I found useful, and therefore there's a wider benefit behind it. So how? Well, I'm going to do a practical example of using a critical thinking model in addition to this one. But it needs to be an example that all learners can in some way identify with. I could take something that's to do with L701, managing the healthcare business, if you're not signed up. No, well, forget the adverts behind that. But it needs to be broader. So what brings everybody together? So having gone on, done the analysis, I then move on to the final element of this model, which is the evaluation. I do the what if. But what if my example doesn't work and I confuse the learners, or I give them a wrong idea of its application? I could get this one wrong, so there's implications behind it. But, well, there's no pressure on me. But because Letsy's already done a fantastic job on this topic, and everybody's going to be enthused by Socrates, actually, maybe that's a lower risk about confusing them. Still there, but it's a lower risk, and I can talk on risk management. So what? So I need to build on the theory. I need to be consistent with the message delivered by that, but I also see that you can actually apply this, both in your assessment and in real life. So I need to make sure that's an important driver in what I then do next. So what next? I think I'm going to use the NHS England oversight framework, but I need to check back on that continuous loop of the who, when, where, how, and all that to make sure it meets the objective. And I also need to make sure that you're really clear that when I go through the next exercise, this is not comprehensive. This is an example. But of course, I'm bringing in a few other academic ones. It's about depth, not breadth. So I'm going to go off in all sort of directions, but I'm just trying to show the process. So if we now move on to the next slide, what I'm going to use this elements of thought, and it's a similar for one that Letzi had of the wheel behind it in terms of purpose question. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to follow this in the logical order. It just helps, and you keep on going back behind it. So that's the model I'm going to do, and it comes from the University of Louisville, but there are other similar ones around this. And I'm just going to go through purpose, question and issue, information concept, etc., etc. So moving on to the next slide. So first of all, the purposes. What am I trying to achieve or make happen? So I'm going to do a general side of it. I'm going to do some form of critical evaluation of the NHS England Oversight Framework 25-26. I don't really know what I want to do, but I'm putting critical evaluation because that's another one to tick the box on your assessment side of things. So immediately I start asking myself the question, well, if I'm doing a critical evaluation, what am I evaluating against? Am I going to benchmark it against other types of oversight framework? Is there an absolute standard out there of what does good look like? Or am I just going to evaluate the principle? I could go in any number of different directions. So I'm trying to narrow down what I'm trying to do. And if you look at what NHS England says the purpose of the framework is, it's a consistent and transparent approach to assessing ICBs, NHS trusts and foundation trusts, ensuring public accountability for performance and providing a foundation for how NHS England works with systems to provide support improvement. Right, so I've got that purpose, official purpose, and I can then break that down into different elements, different understanding, and challenging it. Ultimately, in terms of the purpose, does the end result, which is segmentation and public tables, give the right outcome? Is challenging myself that question. So if I then try to dry this down, and my mind goes in different places, so I change my mind halfway through this one. So the question at issue could be, if I go back to what's the point of this, is it consistent and transparent? That could be the question I really want to ask. But then I go, does consistency and transparency really matter? What might be alternative drivers? Actually, if you think of most people, the first thing they're going to say, do I want transparency and consistency? No. Actually, what I want is fairness. Probably I want some equity in it, and I want something stronger in terms of about that accountability. And then the question comes, do you start to challenge that consistency? Can I really be consistent? Particularly say I've got an acute trust and a community trust. Where's the consistency behind that? And to most stakeholders, and I'm not just talking about NHS England, members of the public, politicians, patients, carers, staff, does transparency matter to most stakeholders? Are they really worried about that? Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But I'm asking those sort of questions, I'm dividing it down. Ultimately, does it assess performance? And actually, if we're looking at it in terms of, does it do it effectively, or could it be equitably? Or is it just easily because it's something like that? And you'll know that the 3 E's of value for money, or those who've been bored by me, the 7 E's, it's looking at different ways of doing it. Ultimately, though, don't miss the proverbial elephant in the room, because one of the things that people will turn around and say is it's actually clinical outcomes was what matter to me, but we can't measure them because they're difficult to measure. And are they actually in there? So it's easy to measure inputs and process and outputs, but outcomes much trickier. Moving on then. So just to remind you that in terms of what's in there, there are the domains in terms of the metrics, and then that process where you've got your delivery score, with a financial override, puts you into segmentation, and segmentation either says you're fantastic, you're up with the angels, or you're about to roast quietly down in hell as we come in to intervene. So just to remind you a bit on that process behind it. Next one, please. So we're starting to talk information. Now I'm playing around a little bit with the wording about this, but what we're looking about is what facts, data, or evidence do I need to figure things out? So really in terms of information, I'm looking at what's the information being used in the assessment process. So I'm not necessarily following exactly the model, but I'm using this. So there are two sides of it that happen. So first of all, trust must first self-assess against a set of criteria across 6 domains derived from the Insightful Provider Board. Immediately being slightly cynical, and being an ex-auditor, I look at the relevance and reliability. How relevant is that the Insightful Provider Board and the 6 domains? And how reliable is a self-assessment? Naturally, if you're on a board, there's going to be some optimism bias. Well, it's 50-50. I'll tick the box and say we're okay. And actually, we know there's a perverse incentive to be much more positive, so we don't get picked up. And also, are the 6 domains an effective means of assessment? So the domains look at strategy, quality, people, access and targets, productivity and finance. Are they the main drivers, if you like, between organizational performance and effectiveness of an organization? The second element is about measured delivery against an agreed set of metrics. So immediately you ask, are they the right metrics? And what do we mean by right? The danger is, are we managing what we can measure rather than measuring what we need to manage? And what is meant by agreed? Who agreed this? And who had disagreed by it? And why did they disagree that those weren't? It went out to a consultation, and there's a consultation behind. It's a real question. If NHSE, fantastic people, superb, brilliant, all agreed it, and a whole lot of other people disagreed it, you've immediately got a problem behind it. And then we get into the concepts. So what you're asking here yourself is, what are the best practice in organizational performance assessment? So good old Google Scholar, off we go. And I did some independent research, which is coming up in the following slides. But what we're looking at is there some benchmark on organizational performance assessment? And the answer is not an awful lot. However, moving on to the next slide, I did find one which links us into that first one, looking at organizational performance assessment in terms of the criteria. This is Odongo's from 2019, and although it's from the International Journal of Manufacturing Technology and Management, it's a cracker. It is from an academic basis. And what Odongo did was look at the literature review around organizational performance, but looking at the drivers of organizational performance. And what was identified is that things like leadership approach, organizational culture, organizational systems and structures, organizational environment, resources and expertise, and organizational adaptation were the real drivers for performance. So my thinking is, if I'm doing a self-assessment, if those are the real drivers and they're meant to link across to the ones that NHSE have chosen in terms of those domains, can we use those for an effective self-assessment? But of course, if we're looking at strategy, quality, people, access, target, productivity, and finance, it doesn't measure across behind that. And things like organizational culture, maybe even leadership approach, aren't in there. So immediately I'm beginning to ask questions about the fitness of this, but I need to then criticize that actually this is generally based on a manufacturing technology, private sector model. Moving on then to the next piece of concept, this is looking at metrics. So this is Aguilera. And again, this is from 2023. So I think it's up to date. It's much more relevant behind that. And it's looking at, and it comes from Journal of Management Studies, so it means more relevant. Again, this research is done primarily on the private sector. But what was interesting in terms of this is brought together in terms of best practice. You look at the determinants that drive organizational goals, drive outcomes, and then that link between success and performance. So the question is, can I use this then to map the metrics that the NHS is using, and do they link into the link to your goals, which are things like access targets, waiting lists, and things like that, and your outcomes in terms of the financial? Do those link through to what is success and therefore what is good performance? Bearing in mind that we've got to make sure there is this assumption of the link of these to success and performance, and this is a private sector model, can we use that in the public sector? And too often I think we go, oh, no, private sector is profit motive. But I think there's enough in there that we can draw out. Moving on then, please. So we then start looking at assumptions, and the assumptions is the really dangerous one of what am I taking for granted that forms the basis of my thinking. And you'll know, I'm sure, why you never assume anything. So if you break it down, it makes an ass of you and me. Important. So what we're assuming here is that there is a causal link between performance assessment and improvement. That if you assess, you can identify who needs what improvement, when, where, and how. And that's the important assumption behind that. But we question it does. Does performance really need improvement? Intervention from outside? Could that performance be improved internally? Or is the poor performance not caused by internal factors, but caused by external factors? And most organizations will turn around and say, oh, it's the funding formula. If they only got Barnett right, all our problems will be solved. Or the ICB don't understand me, or whatever. Of course, as an accountant, I love the financial override because it's critical to the model. But actually, is that critical? Does that put too much emphasis on the importance of money and the break-even duty around that side? And then we look at the NHS priorities, which are the access targets, but are we not really looking at business as usual behind that? And actually, some of the performance may skew because those priorities skew the delivery of other areas which we're not recognizing within it. So we then move on to interpretations, the connections I'm making, conclusions I'm coming to. So I'm beginning to draw myself down into something like that. So my interpretation is that if we can improve the drivers of performance, that's critical. Because I go back to the Odongo one as an important one. I think that's important to me. I need to explore that. But this takes time. It's like turning around the proverbial oil tanker if it's not anchored in the Straits of Hormuz. But we also need to think about the fact that we don't have good objective measurement of those drivers. And it's a model that is consistent and transparent. I'll give that to NHSE. It's consistent, it's transparent, but ... Final slide. I think if I'm right, if I can remember, please, Chloe. So then we think about what are the consequences that follow from my line of thinking. So my implications, I think that the overstaying frame, it's okay as far as it goes. I'm not going to sit on I'm sitting on the fence. Don't worry about this. But it's got weaknesses because of what it doesn't measure. That's what's coming out. And if it's got weaknesses, those weaknesses could cause problems. The balance of metrics are too slanted to outcomes and not to the drivers of performance. So again, we've got this problem that historically we're measuring things rather than necessarily the things that drive it. And also my feeling is that segmentation is too simplistic, especially with that financial override. You damn people because of other circumstances behind it. And then finally, other relevant perspectives. Well, NHS Alliance, when they were looking at it in their review, said it is also vital that the next iteration of the framework sets out better measures for ambulance, community and mental health services, which reflect the breadth and depth of the services they provide. So immediately got another point of view saying, here's a weakness with this one. We're being very polite. Next time round, you can solve it. But actually, it's got a fundamental weakness. So commentaries talk about the uncertainty about the fact NHS and ICBs, because their roles and responsibilities are being merged together, there's uncertainty. There's a real danger that the intervention, which is so important in improving performance, could be fractured. And now the final one is the introduction of this came partway through the year. And of course, the 26-27 framework is still being considered, shall we say. But is that actually unfair, inequitable management? Because if you don't know what the priority, don't know what you're being measured against, is that really fair behind it? So some points of view that go back and make you do that circular movement behind it. So there we go. A quick gallop through a couple of models, trying to demonstrate how you can apply those in practice, both in either just trying to do a presentation or as you might develop an argument that would go into one of your assessments. Back to you, Letzi, please.
Thank you. You gave us a lot of food for thought there. I'll be looking at how we can use critical thinking skills when we're applying it to AI, or perhaps we don't need to use critical thinking anymore because we've got AI. And we'll just be exploring that in a bit more detail in a moment. Next slide, please. Some of you may be familiar with this quote. Millions of years ago, a race of hyper-intelligent pan-dimensional beings decided to build a computer. called deep thought to solve the problem of life, the universe, and everything. After the computer was finally built and the question was posed, the response was displeasing. Deep thought stated it would require an additional 7.5 million years to arrive at an answer. After this long waiting period elapsed, a magnificent ceremony took place, and the pan-dimensional beings waited expectantly for an answer. The answer to the great question of life, the universe, and everything is 42, said Deep Thought, with infinite majesty and calm. And as I say, some of you, there's a question here. Oh, you remember it well. Excellent. This is Douglas Adams, a while ago now, 2007, but still, I think, as relevant as it was even then, from the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So the question I might raise is, did Deep Thought provide a form of artificial intelligence? And you can actually ask artificial intelligence about that. And I think the answer most people would agree with broadly is that AI systems are large language models capable of understanding and generating human language by processing vast amounts of text data. So effectively, they're not necessarily something that can answer the great question of life, the universe, and everything. Next slide, please. So how can artificial intelligence actually help us? Well, there are a number of ways that it's been put forward, and I know that some people are worried about whether they'll have a job in a few years' time, and how will artificial intelligence change the world? How will it change the economy? How will it change everything? Well, I think a number of areas where it does appear to be very good at working, and one is enhanced problem solving. So it can process large amounts of data and information in much less time than it would take a human being, which is very useful, especially in scientific research, finance, and healthcare. Efficient information retrieval, AI-powered algorithms can quickly retrieve relevant information from huge databases, helping professionals to keep up to date with developments in their field. Personalized learning. AI-driven educational platforms can tailor learning experiences to individual needs and preferences in terms of speed, style of learning, leading to better learning outcomes. And the fourth one here, innovative creativity. AI can be a source of inspiration for human creativity by generating new ideas, designs, and solutions. And I think it has a great potential for the future, but I think it needs to be watched carefully and used with care. Next slide, please. So, all of those like quizzing, general knowledge questions. Some of you may know the answer to this. Who was the sole survivor of RMS Titanic? And you may remember RMS Titanic, operated by the White Star Line, was the largest and most luxurious ocean liner of her time and thought to be unsinkable. During her maiden voyage bound for New York, she struck an iceberg in thick fog off Newfoundland on the 14th of April 1912. And in the collision, 5 of her watertight compartments were compromised and she sank. Anyone know the answer to this? Who was the sole survivor? Any quick answers here?
Rose.
Who?
What was that? Repeat that.
What was that one? Rose?
Yeah, Rose from the movie Titanic with Leonardo DiCaprio.
Oh, she. Oh, yes, of course.
Very good
Annie
answer. Said she thought there were loads of survivors.
Oh, well, who thinks there were loads of survivors? Who thinks there was just the one, just Rose?
She said in real life.
Oh, in real life. Oh, fair enough. Okay. Any more thoughts about this before we go on? I thought this was quite a good picture. I think there are a few clues actually within the foreground of this picture about whether there might have been a sole survivor or not. I think those of you that are doubting if there was a sole survivor might be right. Yes.
The
iceberg. Very good. I like that one. Yes, that was a very good one. Any more? Can't read that one.
It says there weren't sole survivors, many survived.
Excellent. Well, we'll go on to the next slide. ChatGPT said the sole survivor of the Titanic disaster was Charles, I think that is Jugan. He was a British baker and the chief baker aboard the Titanic. Jugan managed to survive the sinking by reportedly clinging to an overturned lifeboat and enduring several hours in the frigid water. There's a lot of detail here. Before being rescued by RMS Carpathia. His survival is often attributed to his high alcohol consumption, which may have helped him withstand extreme cold. Jugan lived until 1956 and later provided testimonies. What, after 1956? Oh, okay. About his experience during the Titanic disaster. So does that answer sound correct from ChatGPT? Well, some of you have already doubted it and given other points of view.
Someone said no nonsense.
Oh.
No, but it's fantastic.
Any other thoughts about this? Anybody trust
Very
it?
detailed. No, but I love the movie.
It is, isn't it? I mean, the detail almost. Oh, imaginative.
Yes.
Very good. The detail almost sort of sucks you in, doesn't it? With all that detail, it must be right.
Yeah, exactly.
Next slide.
To show.
AI is said to be hallucinating when it gives false or misleading information. That can make it challenging to determine the accuracy and truthfulness of its responses. And ChatGPT apparently can hallucinate. Oh, no, so left, but plenty of other fish place. So, oh yeah. Thank you for that. That's cheered me up for the evening. ChatGPT can hallucinate on its own, but you can also make that happen by asking it a question based on false information. And an example that I gave previously when we've done this workshop was someone had asked ChatGPT how long it took to walk across the English Channel, and it came up with a fabulous answer with lots of detail again, which was obviously totally false. For example, when it was asked who was the sole survivor of the Titanic here, despite knowing that over 700 people actually survived the catastrophe. So the next thing that the person asking ChatGPT said was, can you give me a bibliography of sources? So he's asking for evidence that he was the sole survivor of the Titanic. Once asked to provide sources, ChatGPT immediately corrected itself. It even apologised this time. So often doesn't. Oh, I can't read that one.
It says he was a real survivor in a data set from a data science project many years ago.
Oh, thank you. So that's obviously the source that ChatGPT had gone to.
Postgraduate.
Oh, of course. Very credible, but not the sole, or the place, or the haddock. So ChatGPT was very, very quick to apologise, whereas I know sometimes ChatGPT doesn't actually apologise. I apologise for any confusion. Oh, certainly a lot of confusion, but there appears to be a misunderstanding too. Right, Charles I may not have pronounced it. If any of you know how to pronounce it better than me, then please tell me. Juhan was not the sole survivor of the Titanic disaster. Well, I think we've concluded that by now. There were approximately 705 survivors out of the estimated 2,224 passengers and crew aboard the ship. And the ChatGPT went on to say, it's important to note that while Charles Juhan was a notable survivor, he was not the only one. There were many individuals who managed to survive the sinking of the Titanic through various means, such as boarding lifeboats, being pulled out of life rafts, or even swimming to nearby wreckages. Well, whereas, of course, we didn't ask anything about that at all. So I think he's just hoping that we'll forget that he made a mistake, or she. I don't know whether ChatGPT is male or female, but that's what I think they're trying to deflect our thinking with that. So I think the learning from this that I draw is that sometimes it can actually give really good or potentially good detailed information, but it may not always be true. So I think it still is something you have to keep an eye on and keep a watch, and maybe find ways of using your critical thinking to find out whether in fact some of the things that it may be suggesting are true or false, and what evidence there is to support that. Next slide. So I think now is the time for breakout discussion groups. where you can discuss the importance of critical thinking in the age of artificial intelligence. How much time do you think we've got for that collectively?
I was going to ask you to.
I know how much
think
I
you're running-
allowed.
You're running quite well.
We're okay. We're doing okay, I think. What, 10 minutes?
Yeah. 10 minutes.
Perfect. So I've put in 6 people per room, so there's around 5 rooms.
Sounds good to me.
Happy with that?
Very happy.
Great.
Thank you.
We will send you into the rooms now.
So we'll see everyone at 2040 or 2041.
Going into the rooms. Yep. Perfect.
Still recording.
I will stop the recording while we